All right. As introduced, I'm Joe Wyatt. I'll be giving a presentation on a recent social study done through EXO Environmental in the UK on stakeholder engagement and understanding of nature-based solutions. I'll just briefly go over nature-based solutions, as obviously we've talked quite in depth about them. So basically, they have a lot of benefits compared to typical grey infrastructure, whereas grey can be seen as sort of dealing with the problem, dealing with the solutions, dealing with the issues, and we can sort of use NBS to promote a more circular economy rather than creating waste. They have multiple benefits. So here you've got a typical salt marsh introduction, which can help with intertidal zone creation, making it bigger, better for habitat creation as well as dealing with tidal wave action to help with erosion. Similarly, you have some ecologically enhanced rock armors there, which are hybrid nature-based, and they sort of do a similar sort of thing. So this study, it builds on previous research. Hang on, it's not, sorry. There we go. So it builds on previous research done in North Norfolk, which focused on public perception of innovative coastal defence materials. In order to cast a wider net, we wanted to discuss and reach out to different stakeholder groups other than the public, although we did obviously speak with the public as well. And we lent on public engagement mainly through Facebook posts and advertising. I'll discuss the challenges and recommendations for future projects on top of that. So there's a structured questionnaire with qualitative and quantitative questions. The three stakeholder groups we targeted were the general public, infrastructure operators, and business landowners and decision makers. The three research areas were Cornwall, Isle of Wight, and North Norfolk. In the brackets are the sort of the towns we mainly focused on, but we got responses from outside those towns as well. We mainly emailed the questionnaire to businesses and decision makers, local councils, as well as directly sharing the questionnaire. We also posted in Facebook groups, local ones, some of them ranging from 500 members up to, I think the highest was 27,000, and as well as using paid advertisement specifically on Facebook too. So this is sort of a timeline of the online engagement over about 2.5 months the study ran. We had two campaigns. Initially, the first campaign, which is the bigger, wider bump there, was over a longer period of time, but the actual radius search area of the advertisement was shorter or smaller, whereas it was sort of the opposite for the second ad campaign, where we cast a wider net in terms of search radius, but did it over a shorter period of time. We also created a Facebook page to complement public engagement, which has, I think, up to now had about 16,500 unique interactions, resulting from interacting in Facebook posts and advertisement and clicks and all that good stuff. I'll briefly go over this. It's a bit of just a bit of bottle in your face at once, but the most cost-effective campaign was in Cornwall, and the least was the second campaign in Isle of Wight. We only advertised in Norfolk once during the second campaign due to having much higher engagement within the first postings. We didn't really need an advertisement campaign then. The most challenging area we tried to reach out to was the Isle of Wight. There was a lot of skepticism and a lot of, say, comments and backlash saying it's a scam, etc., etc. There's a lot of it seemed to stem from Euroscepticism. There's similar comments saying that it's an EU project, we're no longer with the EU, blah blah blah. We, as researchers, tried to curb any spread of misinformation, just clear up any misconceptions. However, this seems to stem from, as I say, Euroscepticism in a post-Brexit Britain. So this is something to take note of for future projects in the UK in terms of wanting to. It would be important to take into consideration past voting preferences if you're, say, going towards Isle of Wight. Just in general, keep that in mind. Right, and just an overview of the results. A few analyses were run on various variables, including the ranking of importance aspects, coastal protection measures, lots of other variables, such as have you heard of NBS, have you witnessed local flooding in your area in the past 10 years, etc. These were measured against local and non-local residents, sex, age, impaired mobility, and coastal hobbyists, stakeholder groups, as I mentioned, as well as research areas grouped by historical pilot projects. So in the areas we typically surveyed, North Norfolk hadn't had any NBS pilot projects historically, whereas Isle of Wight, mainly Solent area, as well as Penzance, New Lynn and Cornwall had. However, generally, all of the answers and responses were fairly similar across the board, with no significant results, suggesting a lot of similar beliefs and preferences towards the questions we were asking. However, there were some deviations, and I'll go over those after this slide. This is just a brief overview of the actual number of responses. So we got 81 total. We got a fairly even spread on sex as well as age. However, we didn't receive any responses from the ages below 26. We also didn't receive any responses from the infrastructure operator stakeholder group. However, we received about 2/3 of our responses from the public and 1/3 from business, landowners and decision makers. So in terms of responses to the rankings of the ranking aspects of coastal protection measures, you can see here the level of protection was ranked highest, followed by environmental benefits and safety, which were ranked similarly. However, environmental benefits had a wider spread. Maintenance cost followed, and then aesthetics and capital costs jointly. Finally, recreational benefits. I just want to point out these were ranked against each other and people couldn't rank them the same, so they had to weigh one against the other, which may have changed the results. However, this is how they came out, with protection being the highest. This question involved participants being given an image of ecologically enhanced rock armor with no information, just asking them to rank how highly they would, or how likely they would want it implemented locally. On the left there are the responses, ranging from middling to high. And then individuals or participants were given extra information on the benefits of the hybrid nature-based solution, and then asked to rate it again. And we found significantly that they were more likely to want it implemented locally, having been educated on the benefits of the product, which really highlights the importance of stakeholder education. There were no variants across any of the other groups in regards to this, so this was generally seen as fairly prevalent across all groups. Interestingly, probably the most interesting result was the fact that non-primary residents ranked the protection aspect of coastal protection measures higher than primary residents. We would have thought perhaps primary residents would have ranked it higher, having obviously lived in the area. However, there's a few possible explanations to this. One might be an optimism bias of local inhabitants, in terms of there's been studies about those living near natural hazards tend to be more optimistic, because obviously you don't want to think about your house going underwater. You're more optimistic, might look at more of the positives. Another may be in the UK, historically, a lot of coastal towns, which are subsequently what we studied in, are sort of on the decline in terms of lowering socioeconomically. So this is also linked to lower education, and a trending theme throughout our study, as well as corroborated with other studies, is that user and stakeholder education is incredibly important in terms of getting stakeholder groups on board with NBS. This was a question on the case that NBS, or in terms of hybrid nature-based solutions, where they're implemented on top of existing grey infrastructure, is typically a higher cost than just normal grey infrastructure. However, it has long-term benefits, as previously discussed, in terms of reduced cost over time. And we just asked them whether they accepted that the higher upfront cost was worth it in terms considering the long-term benefits, and overwhelmingly yes. We did find a significant result in the fact that if people were against the higher upfront cost of NBS, they're more likely to be from the business, landowners, and decision maker stakeholder group. So this might be something to keep in mind for future projects. Might be good to have something in the back burner in terms of dealing with any contention. It'd be good to realise that it may more likely come from that stakeholder group. I won't go over all of this, but this is sort of yes/no responses to 3 questions along the bottom. So it's, have you heard of nature-based solutions? Have you noticed local protection measures? And have you witnessed flooding in the last 10 years? So most of them were yes. The probably most interesting one was, have you heard of nature-based solutions? With it more skewing yes, but that is itself more skewed by Cornwall, the Cornish area, and where most of the responses were they had heard of it. As previously discussed, this could be due to historical pilot studies in the area, so perhaps participant education was a bit higher. However, that wouldn't explain why the Isle of Wight, which has also had similar pilots in the, historically, I mean, they were more middling but veering towards a no, so something to keep in mind there. Right, so just a brief rundown of that. This is just the aspects of coast protection measures as ranked by our stakeholder groups, with protection being highest, and then recreational benefits at the bottom there. And we found, as highlighted, information provided resulted in more positivity, not just in terms of people accepting the higher upfront costs of nature-based solutions with more information, but generally we received a lot of positive feedback from actually educating the stakeholders and participants and giving them more information. They were more positive about certain solutions. Also, we received positive and neutral perceptions on the coastal protection measures and on tourism, and positive responses to the effect of these on businesses and business professions, as well as decision-making professions. Again, hybrid nature-based solutions and nature-based solutions were found to, well, perceived to have positive effects on stakeholder profession and infrastructure, as well as on positive and neutral responses to nature-based solution sustainability. So overall, you can see there weren't really that many negative perceptions on most of the questions we posed. So it's quite a positive and optimistic viewpoint of the stakeholders we found. So some recommendations, and to conclude, as I've mentioned a few times, user education is, or stakeholder, sorry, education is incredibly important to get local inhabitants, decision makers, businesses, landowners on board. This isn't just from this study, it's corroborated with multiple other studies that have shown that this is the case. I think in our last presentation, I can't remember the exact project the person was talking about, but he said about 70 or 80% of their budget was being spent on stakeholder engagement. So I can't stress enough how important it is. Yeah, so obviously focus on the product benefits. Don't shy away if it is going to cost more. Lean into the fact that it saves more over time, as well as the benefits. So it's perceived also to have positive benefits for landowners and businesses. However, if there is contention, we found it's more likely to come from that stakeholder group. So it would be important to keep that in mind. You might want to tackle that and just highlight the benefits that it can have on business and tourism as well. Cool. So thank you very much, everyone. And are there any questions?
So please feel free to either pop your hand up or put any comments or questions in the chat box, and just give everyone 30 seconds or so to have a think, see if there's anything they want to bring up. Great, there we go. Richard, I think your hand was just up first there, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you for that. Yeah, interesting. I suppose one of the sort of issues we've come across when we've been talking about nature-based solutions is the permanency of some of the interventions when you compare them to, say, a more traditional hard engineered scheme. You know, you build a wall and it's guaranteed to last 50 years, 100 years or so. So it's got a defined asset life. I guess nature-based solutions are a little bit less permanent. Just wondered if you explored the appetite from that point of view.
We didn't ask questions in regards to that, so I can't give you the best answer on that. I know from the research I found, though, that participants, I keep saying participants, stakeholders are a bit more trusting of traditional grey infrastructure as is, even though it's been shown that nature-based solutions are incredibly beneficial. It's likely just a historical reason. Obviously, they've been around longer, people understand them more. But yeah, sorry, I can't. We didn't look into that aspect too much. So I can't give you a great answer on that.
Yeah, probably goes back to education, doesn't it? In terms of traditionally, if people can see a fairly sturdy flood defence wall, it gives them that security. But I guess that appreciation and understanding that actually, if you provide a more nature-based solution, software engineering, it can also provide those benefits as well. But it's around just educating, I guess, stakeholders so they have that appreciation.
Yeah, as I've said time and time again now, yeah, education seems king in this sort of thing, just to get people on board. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I suppose it stresses the importance of monitoring as well to be able to demonstrate the duration of benefits of some of these nature-based solution approaches. And Tom, your hand was closely followed. If you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, great presentation, Joe. I noticed you said that there was no one under the age of 26 that participated. And I was wondering, was that mainly because the outreach was through Facebook? And do you think it is important to get young people kind of more engaged and I guess educated earlier on, which will transfer through, to later stages, and then they may get more engagement in the stakeholder groups in the future?
Yeah. So I think the primary reason why we didn't receive responses from below the age of 26 was due to primarily using Facebook. I believe it's sort of more the user bases and interactive users on Facebook is more skewed towards a higher age bracket. So that's definitely one of the reasons. We collected profession information as well, and I think a lot of responses were from the retiree category, so definitely older. Another point on that, I don't know what it's like in other countries. However, in the UK, and specifically the areas that we studied, they do have more retired community, older populations, whereas younger generations are typically more in the cities. The areas that we studied were sort of more smaller towns. So that's also another reason. But yeah, I think also there seems to be a big, obviously, movement at the moment globally regarding climate change, and a lot of younger people are getting involved. So I think that is showing education is increasing and will hopefully have a spillover effect. But yeah, I think Facebook, combined with the fact that it's just a general older population in the areas we studied, is why we didn't receive those. Maybe some recommendations in the future would be to focus more on other platforms such as Instagram. I believe they're more likely to be used by younger generation. But yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Great. Got one final hands up. So just a reminder, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to pop your hand up, and Stas, if we come to you next. That's right.
Hi, good day. I have a very short question. Could you go one slide back to show the recommendations? Okay, I was very curious about this one because I didn't have the time to read it.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. I'll leave it on there.
Great. I'm assuming the two hands left up are kind of legacy hands, but yeah, if anyone's got any. So is it debates, Brendan?
Yes, I was wondering if you also try to go to certain hard to reach target groups. Probably a bit difficult with COVID, but is that also in the planning? Or I worked on a previous project and there we stood like for close to a school gate at the end of the school hours and tried to engage with people who are very busy. usually, but we actually managed to reach them out. So I was curious if you also planned things like that.
So yeah, that's definitely one of the limitations of this study. It was all online, and that was predominantly because of COVID. We wanted to do it that way. We could spend more time planning and analyzing and all that rather than traveling, as well as a lot of the different restrictions at the time didn't really help with that. Yeah, future recommendations, definitely. We think going out and actually speaking to people as well, we might get some more articulate responses too. So yeah, a limitation for sure. It was all done online. However, due to certain circumstances, obviously it was quite difficult to do that in person.
Great, thank you. And Tom, is that a fresh hand?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, legacy hand right there. Just taking it
No
off now.
problem. Great. So that's all the hands up at the moment. There's nothing in the chat at the moment. So yeah, if any questions about the presentation, or also happy, we've got about 20 minutes to have a bit more of a broader discussion, I suppose, about the role of stakeholder engagement, and especially in the context of nature-based solutions. Also very keen, obviously, hopefully we've got a shared interest in this, to be in this breakout room. So any experiences or questions you want to pose to the wider group are more than welcome. So feel free to get involved in any way you see fit. And just, well, yeah, hopefully wait some hands to pop up. Joe, question from you around infrastructure. It sounds like, yeah, unfortunately, infrastructure providers were reluctant to respond. Were there any particular lessons learned, just assessing the importance, I suppose, they play in some of these projects?
I know we didn't receive any infrastructure responses. I personally wasn't dealing with reaching out to them. I know we sent out mass emails. Some got bounced back, whether that was due to just being flagged as spam over time. I haven't got any insights into that, unfortunately. But yeah, definitely future considerations. It would probably be worth, like I just mentioned, setting up meetings. I mean, even online with certain companies, certain, say, wind farm operators, etc., in order to get their views. It may be they're harder to reach out to in person, not in person, by email. So it might be worth contacting companies directly, setting up meetings, which is something we didn't do. But yeah, that'd be probably worth it for future research.
Great. I just wondered if anyone else in the room has any kind of lessons learned or considerations to that. And Stacy, if you'd like to come in.
What are nature-based solutions that could work in this area?
So in the areas we researched, I believe, so currently, as I mentioned, there's a historical pilot projects going on. There's one in Newlyn, which I believe maybe some of the people here are involved with, which I believe are the eco reefs. So they're sort of, we asked actually specific questions about the eco reefs, and stakeholders were more likely to want that because it's like recycled material created reefs underwater can be put around piping to help protect it, as well as help build up sort of life there. So that might be a good example there. In terms of North Norfolk, I believe one was mentioned recently about, I don't remember off the top of my head, so apologies. I think it was something to do with creating wider sandbanks. But yeah, and I guess in terms of Isle of Wight, there's a lot of cliffs there, so it is very context dependent. However, I've not actually implemented myself nature-based solutions, just more focused on the social aspect. I don't know if anyone else has some experience in that.
Happy to hear from the room if anyone has been directly involved in kind of delivery of any kind of nature-based solutions. I know there is a project at the moment in Cornwall. Oh, sorry, Harry.
Yeah, so I was going to say, because like I'm working on the project in Cornwall, is that it still has to follow the process that any project would, as kind of options appraisal and all those classic kind of funding questions. So everything that you have to do with NBS, you still have to apply to the kind of the typical project structure and processes that you have to go through. So it's kind of making sure you can incorporate it into that. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you very much.
Especially I can only speak for our area, Devon, Cornwall, and the city, but it feels very challenging. I suppose traditional funding mechanisms, as Harriet mentioned, aren't necessarily set up for delivery of nature-based solutions. We've got National Flood and Coastal Risk Innovation Programme that is looking to try and provide funding for some more innovative approaches to delivering coastal protection as well as inland. But one of the projects for Cornwall is currently titled Making Space for Sand, which is looking at how dune restoration, engagement and awareness raising can help some of our coastal communities. So it feels like a good point at the moment to start testing some of these options and start bringing them into more mainstream projects. But I think at the moment we're relying quite heavily on accompanying existing harder and grey projects rather than it being the sole solution, but that's definitely the aspiration, I think. And Richard, note your hand there. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, so thank you. I suppose just on a different point, and just I guess to reflect on some of my sort of personal experiences when I've been working, I suppose more so on the Humber strategy that I was on for 4 years, but I guess it also applies to the Leeds project I'm working on now, which is obviously an inland scheme providing nature-based solutions. But one of the things we came across with engagement, particularly with landowners, was you find that some landowners are quite open to sort of doing things on their land and quite innovative and really keen to sort of work with us, and you know, they can into nature and the environment and they get the whole carbon side of things. Other landowners are probably more protective of the land and not as open to change. And you know, you look at the Humber area, a vast area of pretty high grade agricultural land, and they're very protected over that land, and they sort of think that, you know, I think particularly in a sort of post-Brexit world, that we need to do whatever we can to protect food security. And there's certainly an unwillingness to take what they perceive as really good agricultural land out of production to provide nature-based solutions. So again, it kind of goes back to that whole sort of like education and building that evidence base, and also providing, I guess, an alternative source of income for the farmers from that land if they are to take it out of production. So I guess it's just really an observation. There are sort of challenges there in terms of working with some landowners who are quite sort of you know, set in the ways and think that it's all about food production and agriculture, and I guess how we overcome that.
Sorry, Jay, I don't know if you're coming in then.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to mention, yeah, I think in terms of the harder landowners to deal with, it sounds like education very important. I guess if they're thinking more terms of like economy and food security, then it might be worth mentioning the other benefits it could have to their land, and potential economic benefits as well. So yeah, definitely good point.
Yeah, and I just I guess what sort of prompted me to say that was I was talking to a colleague of mine who's one of our senior agricultural advisors, and talking about some event he went to last week, and he got a few comments from some of the farmers there about a scheme we're doing up in a place near Skipton. So it is very far inland, but we planted 250,000 trees on a huge privately owned estate there. It's a 3,000 hectare estate, but a massive tree planting programme. And a few comments came back to my colleague saying, oh, you know, what are you doing up at Skipton, planting all these trees on this really prime agricultural land? So it kind of it showed there is that mindset out there, but at the same time the landowner himself is really sort of like, he's really into rewilding and nature-based solutions. So it's a range of opinions, I guess, that we have to deal with.
Yeah, I feel like hopefully over time as well it'll veer more towards people accepting it too, with as education increases, hopefully.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think as you say, as the evidence base builds, and we've got you know, examples and case studies we can show, and even things like alternative income sources, and trying to make existing land more productive, so it might compensate for losses that we may see in terms of production and yield and so on.
Are you feeling optimistic that Elms will help facilitate that then? Is it?
Yes.
Good. Super. Great. I suppose.
Tom, sorry,
Yes.
Brett here. Yeah, just on land use and grade of land, that it might be the case that we're looking at unsustainable cropping on grade A land. So another reason for having a conversation over risk and resilience to the business, risk and liability in terms of enforcement activity, or quality of water downstream if there was an offtake, say, in terms of either nutrient or soil loss. So that going back to, as you were saying, bottom line, but having a bigger, more in-depth think about that bottom line in terms of what are the real liabilities that business has to look at. So yeah, it's that blended approach. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Brett. Yeah, good points. And I suppose there's that contrast, isn't there, between inland nature-based solution and coastal, where you're typically constrained to a catchment inland, whereas you have the entire catchment to be able to deliver interventions, be it varying degrees of success, I suppose, whereas coastal communities, that intervention tends to need to be directly between, I suppose, the receptor and the community and the source, and that, I'd imagine, provides quite significant challenges when trying to deal with stakeholder engagement, and just the range of opportunities, I suppose, dwindles fastly when you're a coastal scheme. But yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but definitely an interesting kind of perspective how you do influence there. Has, I suppose, anyone had experience with coastal nature-based solutions? Anyone on the call?
Tom, it's Brett here. There's a SARCC, a protected area, designated area in the Tortorridge estuary, that's presently defended by very old, I think 15th century complex banks that were engineered by our Dutch colleagues a few hundred years ago, and they're still there. So well done all. But they are a little lower than the standard of defence. We're thinking sort of 10-year to 50-year standard of defence, and that area behind it has to change in terms of habitat and habitat mix, and therefore land use behind there. So it's interesting engaging with the local community, that there are houses beyond that protected area, but they are not at risk from tidal inundation. But the biggest issue for that community is visual impact of changing wet freshwater wetland to salty wetland, and the heritage value of that. So it's a small mosaic of fields, and it would change dramatically, and has to change dramatically. But it's been our experience that the locals or the farmers or those interested and visitors don't want to see it change until it really has to. I.e., I guess we're humans that will wait until something bad happens to do something about it. So the challenge has been to, again, put that economic case for sustainable business. So, for example, there's a small return on mostly cattle and sheep, and the alternative is a EA sponsored or collaborative sponsored approach to doing an economic evaluation for those landowners based on a different model, which is tourism, basically, bird watchers and others, where the opportunity for blue carbon and tourism outstrips an income by several fold. and that has been a foot in the door, as well as some visualization tools about what the visual impact would be. So that's experience from an ongoing situation in the Tortorridge Estuary in North Devon.
Great, thank you. And were there particular aspects, I suppose, or milestones in the project where stakeholder engagement was pivotal? Sorry, Brett, picking you out there, but yeah, I suppose open to everyone is this kind of notion that I suppose, yeah, it's critical to make sure stakeholder engagement is done well for the duration of the project, but whether there's instances where people have found that it's a very steep kind of rise, I suppose, in importance of that engagement, and it's critical to the delivery rather than just not a nice to do, but a secondary activity.